It began not in the trenches, but in the ledgers, where ink and greed built an empire faster than tanks ever could. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, he inherited a bankrupt nation still paying the price of the First World War. Germany's recovery was a performance of illusion. Factories reopened, unemployment fell, and confidence returned. But behind that resurgence stood a network of financiers and industrialists who saw opportunity in ideology. The Nazi economy was engineered on theft disguised as patriotism. As the Reich expanded, its soldiers marched with bayonets, but its accountants carried lists of vaults, art, and above all gold. Each invasion became a financial conquest, from the central banks of Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands to the private safes of Jewish families. Everything of value was absorbed into a state-run engine of plunder. Trains loaded with bullion left occupied capitals under armed guard, bound for Berlin, or quietly redirected through neutral borders. Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain became lifelines for liquidating stolen wealth, offering discretion in exchange for profit. The Swiss National Bank, operating under the guise of neutrality, bought tons of gold from the Reichsbank, much of it looted from victims of the Holocaust, while the Bank for International Settlements in Basel facilitated transfers between central banks even as Europe burned. Hitler's war was not sustained by ideology alone, but by a calculated, multinational flow of money that blurred the line between commerce and crime. German industry flourished on confiscated resources, fueling corporations like IG Farben, Krupp and Siemens, which supplied everything from explosives to gas chambers. The brilliance of the Nazi financial system lay in its legality. It turned theft into policy, genocide into accounting. What began as conquest by arms became conquest by assets, and as Europe fell, so did the final barrier between morality and profit. Yet the real genius of the Reich's economy wasn't in its aggression, but its deception. Hitler's ministers wrapped corruption in the language of duty, convincing industrialists that war production was national service and foreign bankers that neutrality was virtue. Every stolen coin was washed through legitimate trade. Gold taken from occupied Poland reappeared as Swiss reserves. Czech silver funded Swedish iron shipments, and even American corporations, through complex intermediaries, maintained quiet dealings that blurred allegiance for profit. It was a global ballet of complicity. Everyone pretended not to see, as long as the ledgers balanced. And at the center of it all, the Reichsbank became both a treasury and a laundering house, turning stolen gold teeth, melted jewelry, and confiscated reserves into a currency of empire. Its president, Hjalmar Schacht, and his successors spoke the language of bankers, not generals, yet their calculations determined who lived, who worked, and who starved. By 1943, when the war began to turn, the Nazi state had already achieved something no army could. It had integrated theft into the structure of European finance. The gold that crossed neutral borders did not vanish. It became the seat of post-war wealth, locked in vaults that would one day belong to legitimate nations and banks. The world would later try to separate the blood from the balance sheets, but the truth is that Hitler's economy proved a timeless lesson. Money, once laundered through law and neutrality, never really disappears. It only changes names, faces, and institutions. What the Reich taught the world was not just how to wage war, but how to fund one, and how to hide the spoils behind contracts and signatures that made evil look efficient. The Empire of Gold did not die in 1945, it merely switched accounts. When the smoke of war thickened and borders closed, gold became the only passport that never expired. As Allied blockades tightened around Germany, the Reich's financiers discovered a quieter path to survival, one paved through the polished corridors of neutrality. Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, and Spain were not battlefields, yet their banks pulsed with the rhythm of war. Behind their marble counters, neutrality became a profitable illusion. The Reichsbank moved its stolen reserves through coded telegrams and discreet couriers, disguising the origins of looted bullion with a few strokes of ink and a signature of respectability. Swiss refineries melted gold bars marked with foreign seals, erasing evidence of their crimes before recasting them under the stamp of the Swiss cross. For every ton of plunder that vanished into these neutral vaults, another chapter of history was rewritten in silence. The Bank for International Settlements, founded to stabilize economies after the First World War, found itself entangled in the machinery of the Second. Its vaults in Basel held gold transferred from the Reichsbank, even as the world condemned the occupation of Czechoslovakia. In boardrooms lined with maps and ledgers, Representatives of warring nations continued to sit side by side, speaking the universal language of finance while the world collapsed outside their windows. For them, neutrality was not moral, it was procedural. The bias continued to function as though nothing had changed, proof that money has no conscience, only continuity. In Sweden, the trade of iron ore and ball bearings continued long after moral boundaries had vanished, paid for with Reichsmarks converted through complex exchanges. In Portugal, tungsten exports were settled with gold of dubious origin, its purity unquestioned because its value outweighed its history. And while neutral diplomats issued statements of distance, their economies quietly thrived on the spoils of a continent at war. By 1944, as the Allies advanced and Germany's defeat became inevitable, the hidden bankers began their greatest maneuver, laundering the remnants of a dying empire into post-war legitimacy. Gold was transferred through private accounts, companies were re-registered under neutral ownership, and securities were moved from Berlin to Bern, from Vienna to Zurich, from Lisbon to London. What could not be hidden physically was hidden legally. Shell corporations emerged overnight, holding assets that once belonged to the Reich. When the shooting stopped, these entities remained, stripped of flags but still rich in capital. They became the ghosts of Hitler's economy, reborn as respectable enterprises under new names. When the Allies finally investigated, they found more questions than answers. The Swiss denied knowledge, the BIS defended its neutrality, and the paper trail dissolved in diplomatic ambiguity. Yet deep inside the vaults of Europe, the past remained preserved in metal. Each bar carried a story of confiscated lives, vanished nations, and the price of silence. Neutrality, it turned out, was never free. It had been bought, traded, and secured by those who understood that wars may end, but balance sheets endure. And as Europe prepared to rebuild, these silent channels, forged in secrecy and maintained by survival, ensured that the wealth of a fallen empire would never truly disappear. The war ended, but the money never surrendered. When the flags came down and the trials began, the victors searched for villains in uniforms, while the men in suits quietly returned to their offices. In the ruins of Europe, reconstruction became redemption, and the same banks that had once moved stolen gold now financed recovery. The Marshall Plan rebuilt cities, but the foundations beneath were mixed with hidden capital. Gold once stolen, investments once disguised, accounts once condemned. The Allies demanded accountability, yet practicality triumphed over justice. Germany was to become the industrial heart of a divided continent, and for that it needed its bankers more than its generals. Many of the financiers who had survived the war reappeared as advisors, consultants, and executives, their past obscured by new paperwork and new loyalties. They spoke of rebuilding, but their wealth had never truly fallen. Corporations that had once fueled the Nazi machine, BASF, Bayer, Siemens, and Deutsche Bank, returned to prominence within a decade, forming the backbone of modern Europe's economic power. Each merger and restructuring cleansed a layer of history. Each new logo replaced an old emblem. The Bank for International Settlements, once accused of facilitating the Reich's gold trade, went on to become the discreet nerve center of global central banking. Switzerland's financial secrecy survived every scandal, maturing into the world's most sought-after haven. And while politicians spoke of a new democratic Europe, its financial skeleton still carried the DNA of those wartime decisions. The wealth looted under the Reich had long been integrated, legitimized by time and necessity. Gold melted, accounts renamed, records sealed, and from that alchemy emerged the financial order we live in today. For decades, historians have tried to untangle the moral cost of Europe's prosperity. Some found fragments in declassified ledgers, others in survivor testimonies. But the full story remains elusive, not because the evidence is gone, but because it was never meant to be found. The true victory of Hitler's hidden bankers was not in the fortunes they made, but in how completely they disappeared into respectability. Their influence no longer wore armbands or spoke in propaganda. It hid behind interest rates, corporate boards, and policy meetings that shaped nations in peace as they once did in war. The modern European economy, efficient and disciplined, owes part of its structure to men who learned that control of money was greater than control of armies. And that is the secret buried beneath the skyscrapers and glass towers of today's Europe, that wealth can survive ideology, that capital has no allegiance, and that the world often forgives what it cannot trace. The story of Hitler's bankers is not just about the past, it's about the permanence of power and the silence that money buys across generations. If this story made you think, if it made you question what wealth really means when built on buried truths, then support the journey. Like the video, share it with those who still believe history ends when wars do, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the economy behind the empires.